Next, we're going to talk all about the cell. No, not that kind of cell. Hey, do you guys even know what show this is from, or am I just getting really old? This is the kind of cell we're going to talk about. Remember, the cell is the most basic and smallest unit of life, and cells are what make up life. And it's all you need is to be one single cell to be alive. Like this little protozoa, it's one cell, but it's totally alive, and it's swimming around in some red blood cells here. Now you're going to see there's a lot of different things that cells have, and there's a few different types of cells, but there are 6 things that all cells have to have in common. And here are the things, all right? All cells need to have those macromolecules that we've talked about before. They need to have proteins, nucleic acids, which is the DNA and RNA. All cells need to have carbs because remember, carbs are energy source and they're the source of carbon and they provide support for the cell. All cells are going to need to have a plasma membrane. This is the cell membrane that acts as the boundary between the inside of the cell and the outside. All cells have to have ribosomes. Ribosomes are where proteins get made, and you know proteins are super important. Then lastly, all cells are going to have cytoplasm, which is that jelly-like or that fluidy-like space that's inside the cell. So the first thing that we have to talk about is the plasma membrane, also known as the cell membrane. It's the same thing, okay? Cell membrane is the same thing as plasma membrane. And remember, the job of the plasma membrane is it's going to separate the cell's interior from its exterior, and it's only going to allow certain things in and out. So basically, the membrane is like the gate or the fence that blocks things from getting in and out of the cell so that the cell doesn't get damaged and destroyed. Now, the cell membrane has 2 main parts to it, okay? The first thing it has are these little tails. These tails are made up of lipids. And what can you tell me about lipids? Well, you're going to shout out lipids are hydrophobic, meaning these little tails, they hate water. They're angry. How do you draw angry? They hate water. So basically, you can call these either the lipid tails or the hydrophobic tails. Now remember I told you that usually when lipids are going to be somewhere in the cell, they need a friend. So these lipids have a friend here that sticks onto them. It's like a little lollipop with 2 sticks, okay? So this is actually a phosphate group. So this is the phosphate head that sticks to the lipid tail. And now the lipids are hydrophobic, but the phosphate head is hydrophilic. So meaning it's very friendly and it likes water. Little heart here, loves water. That's the 2 main components of the cell membrane, the phosphate heads and the lipid tails. Now these 2 things together, the lipid and the phosphate together, are called a phospholipid. In the cell membrane, one phospholipid will get very lonely, so it needs to pair up with another friend. So what's going to happen is another phospholipid is going to come in. This time, the 2 lipid tails, they're friends, so they're going to hang out together here in the middle, and the 2 phosphate heads are going to face the opposite ends. So one of the phosphate heads is going to face the outside of the cell, and the other phosphate head is going to face the inside of the cell. So when you have 2 phospholipids that are together, this is 2, so we call this a phospholipid bilayer. So phospholipid bilayer are 2 phospholipids that are hanging out together. Now in real life, the cell membrane has many of these phospholipids and they're all going to line up together. So remember, phosphate heads are going to face now, this is the outside of the cell, and then you're going to have some phosphate heads here facing the inside of the cell. Then all of your lipid tails are going to face each other in the middle of the cell membrane. This is probably the worst drawing you've ever seen, but basically what this is showing you is, again, the phospholipid bilayer. The lipid tails facing each other inside, and the phosphate heads that are hydrophilic facing the outside and the inside of the cell. Now, in the cell membrane, it's not just these alone. There's other things that are embedded in the cell membrane. For example, there could be some proteins that go all the way through the whole membrane. So this little purple thing is a protein. There could be some proteins that only go halfway through. You also have some cholesterol. I'll draw it like this. I don't know why. Okay, this is cholesterol in your membrane. You also have some carbohydrate sugars in your membrane. That's basically what the cell membrane looks like. Here's a really nice picture that really shows you the same thing thing I just drew. Lipid bilayer with the tails facing each other, and then the phosphate heads facing the inside and outside of the cell, and then some pretty proteins and carbohydrates and other things that are inside of them. Now here's something that everybody gets confused about, but don't let it confuse you. The membrane is what we call a fluid mosaic. Now fluid, you guys know what fluid means. It means to move around, like when you have a fluid that can be poured, or when you're fluid, it means you're flexible. So fluid means easy to move. And mosaic, hey, I have a bunch of art majors in this class. You guys know what a mosaic is. It's kind of like a collage. It's like a stained glass window. It's like many pieces that come together. And that's what happens in the cell membrane. These proteins and carbohydrates, they're like the mosaic. They're like the collage in the membrane. But also they're fluid, meaning they don't just stay in one place. They're constantly moving around in the membrane. Here's a video to show you what I mean. Here's the membrane. Those green things are the proteins, and they're constantly moving around. It's very fluid. Another thing about the membrane is if you were to poke it, like that little needle's poking the cell membrane, and you poked it really hard, all of those pieces would come back together because those lipid tails are attracted to one another, so the membrane can go back to its normal form. So let's say this is our membrane, and here's the outside of the cell, and here is the inside of the cell. Now there are some things that need to be able to get either from the outside to the inside, or from the inside to the outside. But this big membrane is acting like a semi-permeable barrier, which is a big fancy word for meaning it's only allowing certain things in and out. It's very selective. So there are some things that can freely move across the membrane. These include small gases, such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. You know, like when you breathe, oxygen needs to be able to get across the cell membrane, and when you exhale, carbon dioxide needs to be able to get out. So those small gases need to be able to get in and out. Some very small molecules, like small hydrophobic molecules, may be able to freely pass. The other thing that may be able to freely pass is water. You know, water is so essential to all life, so water needs to be able to get in and out of the cell. When a molecule freely passes across the membrane, we call it diffusion. So basically, diffusion is the free passage of molecules either into the cell or out of the cell. Now, we have a very special term for when water passes in and out of the cell. We call it osmosis. So osmosis is the diffusion of water across the membrane. And I'm going to give you a few scenarios. Let's say we took this cup or this beaker, and I'm going to put some of your red blood cells in here. So red blood cells, RBC is red blood cells. Now let's say this beaker contains pure water, nothing else, it's just pure water. Now when there's pure water, what's going to happen is the water is going to want to move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So what that means is the water is going to start flowing into the cell. What will happen when water starts flowing into the cell is those red blood cells are going to start to swell up really big till eventually one of them pops open. When this cell pops open because there's so much water coming in, it's called lysis. Anytime you see the word lyse, it means to break open. So these cells are breaking open because they're swelling up like a big balloon. This concentration where there's a ton of water and the water is moving into the cell, this is a hypotonic. So hypotonic is a lot of water but very low salt. Here's what it would look like. Here are some red blood cells. They're in pure water. Watch this guy over here. The water's going into the cell. Oh, it lysed. Oh, that one lysed too. So that's what it looks like when red blood cells lyse because of so much water going in. Oh, they're all lysed. Let's look at the opposite scenario. Now we have a beaker with some red blood cells. This time there's still some water in there, but we're going to put a bunch of salt. I don't know why this salt is orange, but that's what it is, all right? So this is very salty water. Now what's going to happen is the water is going to leave the cell. It's going to exit the cell. So what you're going to see is the cell gets all shrivelly. It's not like round anymore. It's just like a sad, shriveled cell. You know, like when you go swimming in the ocean for too long in that salt water and your hands get all shrivelly, your skin gets shrivelly because of that salt and the water is leaving the cell. So this time, when you see these shriveled cells, there's another name for it when the cell gets like this. It's not lysis, it's called plasmolysis. So this is a fancy name for when the cell gets all shrivelly. This kind of solution where there's less water and more salt is called hypertonic. So hypertonic is less water and more salt in the solution so that the water leaves the cell. How do I remember this? Well, it could be high salt, or if there's high sugar. Anytime there's a lot of either salt or sugar, this is what would happen to the cell. So when you eat a lot of sugar, you get hyper. So when you see a lot of salt or sugar in the solution, it's going to be hypertonic. Now the final solution is when you have an equal amount of water in and out of the cell. So everything is equal. There's no water getting in or out of the cell. It's very happy. This is isotonic. Isotonic is an equal amount of water and salt. So that's osmosis. So I told you some things that can freely move in and out of the cell, like gases and water. But what about things that are really big, like proteins or sugar? These things are too big to freely cross the membrane. They just can't squeeze between those tiny little holes, right? They're too big. So in this case, we're going to need something called transport. Well, during transport, these big molecules will pass across the membrane by passing through a protein channel, a little channel that's in the protein. And even this channel is very selective. It only lets certain things that it likes get in and out of the cell. Now there's two different types of transport. The first type of transport is called passive transport. During passive transport, molecules move from a high concentration to a low concentration, and no energy is needed. Okay, so for example, after you eat a huge meal, like some nachos and some margaritas, there's a ton of sugar in your body. This is the outside of your cell. So there's a ton of sugar in your bloodstream. You're on a sugar high. And so this is a very high concentration of sugar. And the inside of your cell is super hungry. It's like, feed me, person, feed me. So what's going to happen is these sugar molecules can easily pass across the membrane and get into your cell because your cell is so hungry. So some of these sugar molecules are going to pass from high concentration to low, and now your cell's finally like, thank you, you finally fed me. All right, so that's passive transport. And your body's really happy because it didn't need to waste any energy, and all this sugar got in and everything was easy. It was smooth sailing. Now the second type of transport is called active transport. And guess what? It's the exact opposite of passive. In active transport, molecules move from a lower concentration to a higher one. And we're going to require ATP energy. Requires energy. By the way, ATP is your energy molecule, like your energy currency is ATP. So in this case, you haven't eaten any nachos in a long time. There's like hardly any sugar in your bloodstream. You know that feeling like when you haven't eaten in a while and you're like feeling a little dizzy because there's not enough sugar in your bloodstream. So there's very few molecules of sugar on the outside. The inside of your cell seems to have some more molecules of sugar in there. But your cell still needs that sugar. It still needs that energy. It's still kind of sad. This time, these molecules are going to be moving from low to high. So in order for these molecules to get across that protein channel, it's going to require that ATP. It's going to actually require energy for that sugar to get in. So that's active transport, and that's kind of what happens when you're in a low blood sugar state.